Midnight, November 15th, 1942. 9 shells, each one weighing as much as a Volkswagen, tear through the darkness above the South Pacific at 1,400 feet per second. They are invisible. They make no sound until they arrive. 8 seconds later, a 36,000-ton Japanese battleship that survived Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, Midway, and Santa Cruz, a ship that has been at sea since Theodore Roosevelt was president, explodes from the inside. Her bridge collapses. Her steering dies. 212 men are incinerated before they understand what is happening. And in 7 minutes, she is gone. The ship that killed her was never seen. Not by a single Japanese sailor. Not once. If you want more stories like this, battles that changed history, weapons that rewrote the rules, commanders no one remembers, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We find the stories that got buried, and we bring them back. Now, here is what makes this story genuinely insane. The man who did the killing was 54 years old. He wore wire-rimmed glasses. He had thinning hair and a voice so soft that junior officers sometimes leaned forward just to hear him in a meeting. He had spent most of his career in offices, not on bridges. He had never commanded a fleet action before this night. He was not, by any conventional definition, a warrior. He was a mathematician who happened to be wearing a uniform, and in 7 minutes, using a technology his own Navy considered a gimmick, a technology most of his fellow admirals actively distrusted, he did something no American battleship commander had ever done or would ever do again. He fought a night battle entirely by numbers. He never looked at his enemy. He never needed to. His name was Willis Augustus Lee, and almost nobody remembers him. By the time the sun rose on November 15, 1942, the USS Washington had fired 75 rounds of 16-inch shells and 107 rounds of 5-inch shells in 7 minutes. She had not been hit once. Not a single man on her crew had been wounded. Her paint was unmarked. The only difference you could see in the morning light was that her gun barrels were black from breech to muzzle, scorched by the heat of continuous fire. She had sunk a Japanese battleship in complete darkness at 8,400 yards, using nothing but radar and mathematics. To understand why that is almost impossible, you need to understand what November 1942 looked like for the United States Navy. It looked like a disaster. 3 months earlier, on August 7th, American Marines had landed on a small island called Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands chain. The island had one thing worth dying for, a half-finished airstrip the Japanese were building in the jungle, which the Marines captured and finished and named Henderson Field. From Henderson, American aircraft could reach Japanese supply ships. Without Henderson, the entire American strategy for the Pacific, island by island, northwest toward Japan, had no foundation. The Japanese understood this. So they kept coming. Every night, Japanese cruisers and destroyers slipped down a chain of islands the Americans started calling the Slot, shelling Henderson Field, landing troops, trying to take back what they had lost. The Americans called these runs the Tokyo Express, and for 3 months, the United States Navy had almost no answer for them. Because at night, the Pacific Ocean belonged to Japan. This is not an exaggeration. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent 20 years preparing for exactly this kind of warfare. Their lookouts trained for years in low-light conditions, learning to spot silhouettes by starlight. Their optics, their binoculars, their rangefinders, their night scopes, were the finest in the world. Their torpedo, the Type 93 Long Lance, ran on pure oxygen and kerosene, left almost no wake, traveled at 48 knots, and carried a 1,000-pound warhead. It had 3 times the range of anything the Americans had, and it almost never missed. The result was a body count that American newspapers were not allowed to print. Off the island of Savo, in August, 4 Allied cruisers were sunk in 32 minutes. The Japanese force arrived unseen and vanished before the survivors knew what had happened. The Americans had radar that night. Their crews did not trust it. They were still looking with their eyes when the first salvos hit. In the waters around Guadalcanal, waters so full of sunken ships that sailors started calling it Ironbottom Sound. The math was simple and brutal. Japanese eyes beat American technology every single time. Not because the technology was bad, because nobody believed in it enough to use it. Then came November 12th. Two American admirals, Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, took a force of cruisers and destroyers into Ironbottom Sound to stop a Japanese battleship from shelling Henderson Field. What followed was not a battle. It was a knife fight in a closet, with searchlights and torpedoes and ships firing at whoever they could see, and sometimes at whoever they couldn't. By morning, both Callahan and Scott were dead. They are the only two American flag officers killed in surface combat in the entire Pacific War. They died within minutes of each other on different ships in the same patch of water. 2 cruisers went down. 4 destroyers went down. The light cruiser Juno, already gutted, was later torpedoed by a submarine and lost with nearly her entire crew, including 5 brothers from Waterloo, Iowa, all named Sullivan. More than 700 American sailors were dead, and the Japanese were coming back the next night with another battleship. Her name was Kirishima, 30 years old, a veteran of Pearl Harbor. Around her would sail 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 9 destroyers. Their orders were simple: tear Henderson Field apart with naval gunfire, land reinforcements, end the campaign. The man who had to stop them was Vice Admiral William A, the commander of the South Pacific. He had almost nothing left. His cruiser force was shattered. His destroyer squadrons were depleted. He had exactly 1 carrier in the area, the wounded USS Enterprise, still patching battle damage from earlier engagements. And Enterprise had 2 battleships escorting her, Washington and South Dakota, whose doctrine-assigned job was to protect the carrier from air attack. Doctrine said you do not strip a carrier of her battleship escort. Doctrine said you do not send fast battleships into a night surface action in confined waters full of torpedoes and wrecks. Doctrine said you wait for daylight, when aircraft can do the killing cleanly. Halsey read the message traffic. He looked at the chart. He saw what was coming down the slot. He tore Doctrine in half. He detached Washington and South Dakota from Enterprise, gave them 4 destroyers, and sent them north into Ironbottom Sound. 6 ships against 14. And then he put the whole thing in the hands of a quiet 54-year-old in wire-rimmed glasses who had spent the last 3 years arguing with admirals about a technology most of them thought was a toy. Willis Lee was born in Natley, Kentucky in 1888. He grew up in a small town. He was not a dramatic man. He was not the kind of officer who gave speeches or sought glory or cultivated powerful friends. He was the kind of man who read technical manuals on his off-watch and wrote equations in the margins of his notes during staff meetings when other admirals were making speeches. What he was, in ways that are genuinely difficult to overstate, was a shooter. In 1920, at the Antwerp Olympics, Lee competed in the shooting events. He won 7 medals, 5 gold, 1 silver, 1 bronze. He was the most decorated athlete of those games. The record stood for 60 years. When other young officers were building their reputations on fleet maneuvers and socializing with the right commanders, Lee was studying the physics of marksmanship. Wind drift, barometric pressure, the way the Earth's rotation pulls a bullet across 1,000 yards, the way tiny errors compound at extreme range until the difference between a hit and a miss comes down to numbers that most shooters never think to calculate. Precision was everything. Feel was nothing. He brought that exact mindset to naval gunnery. And in the 1930s, when the U.S. Navy began getting its first reports about a new technology called radar, radio waves bounced off targets, returning as echoes, giving range and bearing in clean, hard numbers. Lee understood immediately what he was looking at. Not a backup system, not a gadget, a revolution. He went to the laboratories. He read every report the British sent back from the Atlantic, where they had been using radar in combat for 2 years. He talked to the engineers. He understood the wavelengths and the antenna geometries and the failure modes and the limitations. It is said by men who served under him that Willis Lee knew more about radar than his radar operators did, and he understood something that no other senior officer in the United States Navy had yet grasped. The problem was never the technology. The technology worked. The problem was the culture. The problem was that battleship captains had spent 30 years learning to glance up from a chart and verify things with their own eyes, and asking them to fight a ship they could not see, at a range they could not personally confirm, on the authority of a green glow on a cathode ray tube. That was not a technical challenge. That was a psychological one. In August 1942, Lee was given command of Battleship Division 6, the new fast battleships Washington and South Dakota. He made Washington his flagship, and then he did something that was considered, by most of the officers who heard about it, to be insane. He rebuilt the ship around the radar. In the standard American doctrine of 1942, radar was a support tool. You found the enemy visually, you confirmed the range with radar if you had time, and the bridge made all the decisions. Information flowed up through layers of officers and talkers, each one verifying, each one filtering, each one adding seconds. By the time the guns received a firing solution, the picture was already old. Lee cut out every layer. On Washington, the SG surface search radar fed the plotting room directly. The Mark III fire control radar fed the gun directors directly. And the Mark VIII rangekeeper, an analog mechanical computer the size of a small room, full of gears and cams and differential equations made of steel, weighing several tons, received those signals and solved the firing problem continuously, in real time, while the ship was maneuvering and the target was moving and the wind was shifting. The men in the plotting room did not need to see the enemy. They did not need to know the color of the sky. They needed to trust the numbers. Lee drilled them on this. He drilled them in fog. He drilled them in rain. He drilled them at night with the lookouts blindfolded. He fired Washington's main battery in exercises off Casco Bay, Maine, in complete darkness, using nothing but radar, and the shells landed within yards of target sleds that the gunners never saw with their eyes. The officers who watched these drills said nothing complimentary. The general view among senior American naval commanders in 1942 was that radar was useful for finding convoys in bad weather and avoiding collisions in peacetime. The idea of fighting a night action against a Japanese battleship using only electronic data without a single visual confirmation was not a doctrine that anyone had written down anywhere. It was not a doctrine that anyone wanted to write down. It was, in the professional consensus of the United States Navy, a crazy idea. Lee kept training his crews anyway. Captain Glenn Davis, the commanding officer of USS Washington, was 49 years old. Career officer, quiet man. The kind of officer who read manuals. He listened to Lee. He drilled the procedures. He said very little. And somewhere in the months between August and November 1942, off Casco Bay, in the rain and the dark, watching shells land on target sleds no one could see, he decided, in his own quiet way, to believe. By November 14, 1942, Washington's crew had done something no other American battleship crew had done. They had learned to fight by electronics. They had learned to fight blind. None of them knew yet that in less than 12 hours, everything they had practiced was about to be tested for real. Against a ship that had been at sea since 1915. Against a crew that had trained for night warfare their entire careers. Against optics the rest of the world could not match. 6 ships against 14. Confined waters, no moon. Visibility under a mile. And somewhere to the north, coming down the slot at 18 knots, Kirishima was heading for Henderson Field. When Task Force 64 rounded the western point of Guadalcanal at 2300 hours and turned north into Ironbottom Sound, Lee sent one message to all ships on the short-range circuit. "This is Lee. We are going into a big fight. Keep your heads. Stay alert. Trust your instruments. That is all. No speech, no glory. No mention of the men who died 2 nights ago. Just 4 sentences. And one instruction that the entire history of naval warfare had never yet put to a real test. Trust your instruments. What happened in the next hour would cost 4 destroyers, 200 American sailors, and a Japanese battleship her life. It would end one age of warfare and begin another. And the man at the center of it would never give a single interview about it for as long as he lived. In Part 2, we go inside Ironbottom Sound. As the destroyer screen is torn apart in minutes, South Dakota goes blind in the middle of the fight through a single catastrophic electrical mistake. And Willis Lee, alone in the dark with one battleship and a green glowing screen, makes the decision that ends Kirishima's career in 7 minutes flat. 6 ships, 14 Japanese warships, Ironbottom Sound, no moon. That was where we left Willis Lee. A quiet mathematician in a uniform, sailing north into the dark with a radar system. His own navy considered a gimmick and 4 destroyers that were about to be destroyed. In Part 1, we watched Lee spend 2 years rebuilding USS Washington around a technology nobody trusted, drilling his crews blind and convincing one captain, just one, that mathematics could replace eyesight in a sea battle. Halsey sent him north because there was nobody else. 6 ships against 14, and the instruction that would either save Henderson Field or end Willis Lee's career. Trust your instruments. Here is what nobody tells you about what happened next. Before Washington fired a single 16-inch shell at Kirishima, Lee lost his entire destroyer screen in 11 minutes. 2 destroyers sunk, one with her bow blown off, one limping south on one engine. Roughly 200 American sailors dead or in the water. And the man responsible for all of it was not a Japanese admiral. The man responsible was an American engineer who wired a circuit breaker shut. At 23:05 hours, Washington's SG radar painted the first Japanese contacts beyond Savo Island, multiple groups moving south. The plotting room fed the numbers up to Lee. He stood by the chart in flag plot, headset on, listening to ranges and bearings come down the wire. 12 contacts. 14. The count kept climbing. Kondo had split his force into 3 separate groups, exactly the kind of layered attack designed to overwhelm a smaller defending force from multiple angles simultaneously. Lee sent 4 words to every ship in the formation: trust your instruments. Then he went quiet. Commander Thomas Fraser, aboard the lead destroyer Walk, saw the Japanese destroyer screen appear on his SG radar at 12,000 yards. He asked Lee for permission to launch torpedoes. It was the obvious play. 10 Mark 15 fish in the water at long range, the Japanese dodging and reacting before they even knew what task force they were facing. Lee said no. The reason was mathematical. In confined waters, at night, with multiple ships maneuvering at 30 knots in every direction, there was no way to distinguish American torpedoes from Japanese ones once they were running. Friendly fire by torpedo had happened before. It would happen again if Lee allowed it. Guns only. Hold station. Fraser acknowledged and passed the order to his gun crews. He had 18 minutes left to live. At 23:17, Washington's main battery fired for the first time in her career, sending 9 16-inch shells into the Japanese sweep group to the south. The light cruiser Sendai saw the muzzle flash and ran. The Japanese on the radio circuits were talking over each other, excited, numerous. They had no idea American battleships were in the Sound, but the Japanese destroyer, Ayanami, found the American destroyer column by eye. Her lookouts, dark adapted for hours, spotted the silhouettes of Walka and her sisters against slightly lighter water. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Sakuma, did not need radar. He had spent his career training for exactly this moment. Ayanami launched long lance torpedoes. Then her searchlight snapped on and pinned Walk in a beam of white light at point-blank range. Every Japanese gun in line of sight opened fire. Walk was hit in her forward superstructure within seconds. The bridge took splinters. Fires bloomed along the deck. Fraser ordered hard left rudder and returned fire. Walk's 5-inch battery hit Ayanami, blew out her searchlight, knocked down a deckhouse. But 2 more Japanese destroyers joined the firing line. The light cruiser Nagara added her guns at 8,000 yards. At 23:26, a shell penetrated Walk's forward magazine. The forward half of the ship disintegrated in a single fireball. Commander Fraser was gone before he knew the magazine had been hit. Walk broke in 2 and sank in under a minute. 75 men died with her. Preston was hit next. Her SG radar antenna was destroyed in the first salvo. Her after-engine room took a penetrating hit, and every man inside was killed by superheated steam before any of them could climb a ladder. Then a long lance hit her amidships and broke her keel. She folded and sank in 30 seconds. 117 men dead. Benham took a long lance at the waterline, 30 feet from her bow. The entire forward section, 60 feet of destroyer, simply ceased to exist. But the main watertight bulkhead held, and Benham stayed afloat, 60 feet shorter than she had been a minute earlier, limping south at 5 knots. Every man aboard survived. Gwynn, last in the column, took a shell in her after-engine room and kept moving on one shaft. 11 minutes. 2 destroyers on the bottom. 1 dying, 1 wounded. The screen was gone. And now South Dakota was about to destroy herself. Captain Thomas Gatch aboard South Dakota was an aggressive officer. He did not want to sit behind Washington in formation. When the destroyer action erupted to his north, he maneuvered independently, swinging to starboard to find a firing solution, moving into the burning wreckage of Walk and Preston. It put his ship silhouetted against the fires of 2 burning American destroyers. But the disaster that crippled South Dakota did not come from Japanese guns. It came from a single decision made hours earlier, before the battle began, in one of her main electrical switchboards. An engineer had been dealing with a circuit breaker that kept tripping. Under pressure to keep every system online for the coming fight, he wired the breaker down, locked it shut, forced it to stay closed, even if a fault tried to throw it open. It was a violation of every electrical safety regulation in the United States Navy. At 23:33, a fault occurred somewhere in South Dakota's power grid. The breaker that should have tripped could not. The fault cascaded upstream, tripping every breaker in sequence. And in seconds, the entire main electrical distribution of a 35,000-ton battleship went dark. Radar out. Fire control out. Gun directors frozen. Radios dead. The most modern battleship in the Pacific Fleet went blind in the middle of an engagement she had not yet finished joining. She drifted forward on momentum toward the Japanese main body. She had no sensors. She had no way to fire her main battery in centralized control. She had no way to talk to Lee. She was sailing by dead reckoning into Kondo's cruisers and Kirishima. Partial power returned just in time for one thing. Atago's searchlight found her. The beam locked onto South Dakota in under a second. She was perfectly framed, silhouetted from behind by the burning destroyers, lit from the front by a searchlight. Her gun directors were still rebooting and could not suppress. Every Japanese ship in line of sight opened fire. Kirishima's 14-inch main battery fired at 5,500 yards. Atago and Takao added 8-inch guns. Nagara added 6-inch. South Dakota was hit at least 27 times in 3 minutes. Her forward main battery director took a direct 14-inch hit. The shell did not penetrate the armor. It did not have to. The kinetic shock killed every man inside. Her radar antennas were shattered by fragments. Secondary gun mounts were knocked off their pedestals. 39 men were killed. 59 more were wounded. Captain Gatch ordered a hard turn to starboard and broke contact. South Dakota disappeared south into the dark, fires burning along her topsides. She had been in combat with Kondo's main body for less than 5 minutes. In the operations rooms of 3 Japanese ships, a quiet certainty settled in. They had defeated the American battleship. The path to Henderson Field was open. They had gutted the American force. The night belonged to them, as it always had. They believed that. They believed it for 19 more minutes. What Kondo did not know, what his lookouts could not see, what his radar, primitive compared to Washington's, could not separate from surface clutter, was that there was a second American battleship in the Sound. She had been there the entire time, 2,000 yards north of the burning destroyers, hidden in deeper shadow, her guns tracked and loaded. Her plotting room running numbers continuously on the largest contact remaining in the Japanese line. In the plotting room below Washington's armored deck, 4 men sat around the Mark 8 rangekeeper in red battle light, gears turned. Cams shifted. The targeting solution updated every 2 seconds from the Mark III fire control radar 60 feet above their heads. Bearing 330. Range 8,400 yards. Speed 18 knots. 9 16-inch rifles in 3 triple turrets were pointing at a ship none of the men in that compartment had ever seen. Captain Davis glanced at Lee. Lee was watching the SG radar repeater. The bright point of light on the screen. Kirishima, fat and slow and completely unaware, moved steadily across his display. He had been tracking her for 20 minutes without firing. He had watched his destroyers die. He had watched South Dakota go dark and drift into the killing zone. He had said nothing because there was nothing to say. The mathematics were not finished yet. Now they were. Lee turned his head. His voice on the talker was almost mild. "Give me the range and bearing of the largest target." The talker read them back. Lee listened, nodded once, looked at Davis. "Stand by, Glenn. Here they come." At midnight, exactly midnight, the 14th of November turning into the 15th, Washington's 9 16-inch rifles fired as one. The blast lit the sea for half a mile in every direction. The shockwave emptied the air from a man's lungs on the open deck. 24,000 pounds of steel and explosive left the muzzles in a single second. The ship herself heeled to starboard 8 feet from the recoil. 9 shells climbed to 20,000 feet at the top of their arc. They came down steep, at the angle that finds deck armor, the thinnest plate on any battleship. Time of flight, 20 seconds. On the bridge of Kirishima, Captain Iwabuchi was watching the approach to Henderson Field when the deck exploded under his feet. 2 shells struck the bridge tower. Both detonated. The rangefinder disintegrated. Fire control wiring was severed in the same instant. Communications died. Men around Iwabuchi were killed by concussion alone, without a single fragment touching them. He was knocked off his feet, got to one knee, tried to call the gunnery officer. The phone was dead. The second salvo arrived 30 seconds later. 1 shell penetrated the armor deck near the forward magazines. Fires spread. Iwabuchi ordered the magazines flooded, the standard response to prevent catastrophic detonation. The flooding saved the ship from blowing up instantly. It also disabled the entire forward main battery permanently. The third salvo hit amidships. 1 shell entered the forward engine room. Boilers ruptured. Steam lines burst. The engineering watch died before any man had time to climb a ladder. Another shell found the after engine room. Kirishima's speed fell through the floor. 20 knots. 15. 10. The fourth salvo destroyed her steering. A shell exploded in the steering gear compartment, cutting the hydraulic lines. Her rudder jammed. She began circling slowly to port, unable to control her own course. The fifth salvo opened her below the waterline. Water poured in. The list began. The sixth salvo finished her after turrets, the only guns she had left. In 7 minutes, Washington fired 75 16-inch shells and 107 5-inch rounds. Between 9 and 20 of the 16-inch shells hit. Kirishima was dead in the water, on fire, listing, and unable to respond. Lee ordered ceasefire. Japanese destroyers had been launching torpedoes throughout the engagement. Dozens of long lancefish running on courses set by men guessing at Washington's position from her muzzle flashes. Lee ordered the helm hard over, and Washington zigzagged at 25 knots through torpedo water she could not see. One wake passed 100 yards ahead. Another ran the length of the ship within what one lookout later described as touching distance to starboard. None of them hit. By 0130, Washington was clear. By 0300, Lee ordered the withdrawal. Henderson Field was safe. Behind them, at 0325, Captain Iwabuchi ordered the seacocks opened. Kirishima rolled to starboard and went down by the bow. 212 men went with her. Willis Lee wrote one letter to Halsey afterward. No speech, no glory. Just one paragraph that naval historians still quote 80 years later. We realized then, and it should not be forgotten now, that our entire superiority was due almost entirely to our possession of radar. We have no edge on the Japanese in experience, skill, training, or performance of personnel. A victorious commander telling his theater commander in writing that his men were not better men, that the only reason any of them were alive was a machine. The Navy filed the letter. Lee gave no interviews. He appeared on no newsreels. But the admirals who read that letter, and the planners who studied the Washington's action report in the weeks afterward, finally understood what Lee had built. In the months following Guadalcanal, the United States Navy created the Combat Information Center, the CIC, a dedicated compartment where radar, sonar, electronic warfare, and weapons control fed into a single tactical picture, exactly as Lee had built it in Washington's plotting room. The CIC became standard on every warship larger than a patrol boat. It is still the central nervous system of every navy in the world today. And the Japanese, reading their own after-action reports from Guadalcanal, understood something that would drive the next phase of the Pacific War in ways that nobody in Washington yet anticipated. The Americans had found a way to fight in the dark. In Part 3, we follow what happened when the Japanese decided they needed to solve the radar problem, and the lengths they went to in order to steal, copy, and counter a technology that was costing them the Pacific one night action at a time. In Part 1, a quiet mathematician named Willis Lee spent 2 years rebuilding USS Washington around a technology his own Navy considered unreliable, drilling his crews in complete darkness until they could fight a ship they could not see. In Part 2, he sailed 6 ships into Ironbottom Sound against 14 Japanese warships, lost his entire destroyer screen in 11 minutes, watched South Dakota go blind from a wired-shut circuit breaker, and then put 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima in 7 minutes without a single man aboard Washington being touched. The Japanese had never seen anything like it. They said so in writing. Within 72 hours of Kirishima going to the bottom, Imperial Japanese Navy intelligence began filing reports that described something that did not fit their tactical framework. An American battleship had engaged and destroyed a Japanese capital ship at night, in confined waters, at combat ranges, without once using a searchlight, without once giving visual indication that she had a firing solution. The shells had simply arrived, clean, accurate, devastating. The Japanese after-action assessment used one word repeatedly: mysterious. Here is the number that changed everything at Imperial Navy headquarters in Truk. Before November 15, 1942, American surface forces had won exactly 0 night engagements against Japanese capital ships in the entire Pacific War. 0. The record was not close. The night belonged to Japan, and everyone on both sides understood that as a fixed fact of the war. After November 15th, American surface forces won 7 of the next 9 major night engagements in the Solomon Islands campaign. 7 out of 9. The Japanese did not change their tactics because they wanted to. They changed them because they had no choice. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from his flagship Yamato, called an immediate review of night surface doctrine. The review lasted 3 days. The conclusion was not reassuring. Japanese radar technology in late 1942 was 2 to 3 years behind the American SG surface search radar that Lee had used to track Kirishima across Ironbottom Sound. Japanese sets were shorter range, less precise, and far more difficult to read in surface clutter. The Type 93 long-lance torpedo remained the finest in the world, but a torpedo requires a firing solution, and a firing solution in darkness without reliable radar required the one thing Washington had denied Kirishima entirely: time. The Japanese had built their entire night doctrine on a simple premise: find the enemy first by optic, illuminate with searchlight, saturate with torpedoes before the enemy can respond. In 3 years of operations, it had worked almost every time. Washington had broken the premise at its foundation. She had found Kirishima first, by radar, invisibly, and destroyed her fire control before Kirishima's lookouts had any reason to search in Washington's direction. Japanese engineers were ordered to accelerate radar development immediately. The program had existed before Guadalcanal, but at low priority. After November 15th, it became urgent. They stripped captured Allied radar sets for reference. They studied wavelength data pulled from signals intelligence. They worked for months. The sets they produced were functional. They were not competitive. But the technological gap was only one of the problems Lee's 7 minutes had created for the Imperial Navy. The deeper problem was psychological. Japanese destroyer and cruiser captains, who had operated in the slot for months, began reporting a new phenomenon in their action summaries. The sensation, at night, of being watched without being able to see what was watching. Ships taking accurate fire at ranges and in conditions that should have made accurate fire impossible. The Long Lance's great advantage, its invisibility, its lack of wake, was neutralized if the enemy was not looking for wake in the first place, but instead tracking hull returns on a radar screen from 10,000 yards. The Tokyo Express continued running down the slot through December 1942 and into early 1943. But the confidence that had characterized those runs through August, September, and October was gone. Japanese commanders began requesting air cover for their night operations. Air cover that was not available. They began arriving later, departing earlier, spending less time in the Sound. The sustained shelling operations that had kept Henderson Field under constant pressure became shorter, less effective, harder to coordinate. The Marines on Guadalcanal noticed the difference before the admirals did, and this is the point where the internal argument inside the United States Navy became genuinely dangerous. Success had done what failure never managed to do. It had created factions. In the weeks after Washington's action, two separate schools of thought formed inside the Pacific Fleet's surface warfare community. The first said Lee had proven the doctrine, and the fleet should standardize on radar-first engagement procedures immediately, stripping out the visual confirmation steps that added seconds of delay to every firing solution. The second said Lee had gotten lucky in specific conditions. Confined waters, no moon, a stationary target that had already been damaged and was not maneuvering, and that standardizing on radar alone would get ships and men killed in more complex tactical situations. The argument was not academic. Radar sets varied in quality and calibration across the fleet. Operators varied in training and experience. What Lee had built in Washington over months of intensive drilling could not be replicated overnight in every cruiser and destroyer in the South Pacific. Ships that tried to fight by radar without Lee's level of preparation were fighting with a tool they did not fully understand. In January 1943, the cruiser Chicago was sunk off Rennell Island in circumstances that fed every doubt about the new doctrine. A Japanese air torpedo attack at night. Chicago's radar detected the incoming aircraft. Her fire control did not respond in time. 19 men died. Critics of the radar-first approach pointed at Chicago and said, "See, the equipment alone is not enough." Lee read the Chicago report. He agreed with the critics in one specific sense and disagreed with them in every other sense. The equipment alone was never enough. That had been his argument from the beginning. The equipment plus the training, the drilling, the cultural willingness to override visual instinct and trust the numbers. That was the whole point. Chicago had the equipment. Chicago had not done the drilling. The distinction mattered enormously, and the battle that proved it beyond any remaining internal argument happened on the night of July 6, 1943, in the waters off Kolombangara Island, in an engagement the Navy called the Battle of Kula Gulf. July 5, 1943. The slot. Captain Francis McInerney commands a force of 3 destroyers, Strong, Chevalier, O'Bannon, tasked with intercepting a Japanese reinforcement convoy running south with troops for Kolombangara. The Japanese force consists of 10 destroyers, 3 American ships against 10. Before Guadalcanal, the math is a death sentence. After Guadalcanal, the math is a problem with a solution. McInerney's ships have SG radar. His crews have spent 4 months drilling Lee's procedures. They have the Mark 37 gunfire control system, feeding solutions to their 5-inch batteries without visual confirmation required at any point in the kill chain. At 0126, The SG radar on Strong paints the Japanese column at 10,500 yards, bearing north-northeast, speed 30 knots, course southwest. McInerney does not illuminate. He does not wait for a visual. He does not call for confirmation. He fires. Strong's forward battery opens up. Chevalier follows 2 seconds later. O'Bannon 6 seconds after that. 18 5-inch shells are in the air simultaneously before a single Japanese lookout reports contact. The lead Japanese destroyer, Nizuki, takes the first salvo on her bridge. Her commanding officer is dead before the second salvo arrives. Her torpedo mounts, loaded and ready for launch, are hit by fragments from the third salvo. 2 long-lance torpedoes detonate in their tubes. The explosion breaks Nizuki's back, and she goes down in under 4 minutes, carrying her entire bridge crew. The Japanese column fractures. Destroyer Nagatsuki turns hard to starboard to clear the wreckage. She runs aground on a reef off Kolombangara at 30 knots. She is still there at dawn when American aircraft find her and finish the job. Destroyer Hatsuyuki, attempting to launch torpedoes at the muzzle flashes of the American ships, fires her spread at a bearing 800 yards wide of O'Bannon's actual position. The long lances run clean through empty water. The Japanese return fire is real and it is dangerous. Strong is hit by a long lance and sinks. 26 men die. But the torpedo that kills Strong is launched from a Japanese destroyer that never achieved a radar or visual solution. It is area fire into the patch of sea where the muzzle flashes came from. It finds Strong by chance, not by aim. The exchange ratio tells the story in pure numbers. 1 American destroyer sunk, 26 killed. 1 Japanese destroyer sunk, 1 grounded and destroyed, 1 damaged, more than 300 Japanese sailors dead, and the reinforcement mission aborted without landing a single soldier on Kolombangara. Before November 15, 1942, a 3-against-10 night action in the slot had one expected outcome. After November 15th, the expected outcome had reversed. The Japanese commander of the Kolombangara Reinforcement Force filed his after-action report to Truk the following morning. The language was specific. American forces engaged before visual contact was established. Accuracy of initial salvos suggests radar fire control of high sophistication. Recommend suspension of night convoy operations in upper slot, pending development of countermeasures. There were no countermeasures, not then, not in time. Between November 1942 and August 1943, American surface forces in the Solomons fought 14 major night engagements. They won 11. Before Lee's action at Guadalcanal, the corresponding ratio had been 2 American wins in 8 engagements. The shift was not incremental. It was structural. Lee had changed what a night surface action was, at a fundamental level, and the Japanese never found an answer inside the time frame that mattered. Guadalcanal was formally secured on February 9, 1943, 86 days after Washington put Kirishima on the bottom of Ironbottom Sound. The Japanese evacuation, Operation K, pulled 10,652 soldiers off the island in secret over 3 nights. They left behind 7,000 dead from combat and 14,000 dead from disease and starvation. They left Henderson Field intact and operational, the airstrip that had started the entire campaign. The domino that Lee had prevented from falling held every domino behind it upright. From Guadalcanal, American forces moved up the Solomons chain, then to New Guinea, then to the Marianas. The island-hopping campaign that ended at Tokyo Bay in September 1945 traced a direct line from a single 7-minute engagement on a dark night in November 1942. Willis Lee was awarded the Navy Cross. He was promoted to Vice Admiral. He was given command of every fast battleship in the Pacific Fleet, and spent the next 3 years at sea, working himself through the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. He never gave an interview about Guadalcanal. He never sought credit. He kept writing equations in the margins of his notes during staff meetings while other admirals made speeches. In 1945, The Navy assigned him to lead a task force studying new radar technologies and electronic warfare systems for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. They needed the man who understood what radar could do better than any other flag officer alive. He never made it to that invasion. But here is the question that Part 4 will answer. The one that matters more than the battle statistics, more than the promotion, more than the Navy Cross sitting in a box. What happens to the man who changes everything and then disappears? Willis Lee is buried at Arlington National Cemetery under a plain white marble headstone that mentions his Olympic medals and does not mention Kirishima. The Combat Information Center he invented is on every warship in every navy in the world today. His name is not on any of them. That story, the story of what happens after you win, has one more chapter. And it is the chapter that almost nobody knows. In 3 parts, we followed a quiet man in wire-rimmed glasses who spent 2 years rebuilding a battleship around a technology his own navy called a gimmick, sailed 6 ships into Ironbottom Sound against 14 Japanese warships, lost his entire destroyer screen in 11 minutes, and then destroyed a 30-year-old Japanese battleship in 7 minutes without a single man aboard his ship being touched. We watched that 7-minute engagement reverse the entire night surface warfare balance in the Solomon Islands, shift the win rate from 2 in 8 to 11 in 14, and accelerate the collapse of Japanese control over Guadalcanal in ways that compressed the Pacific War's timeline by months, possibly years. We left with one question hanging. What happened to the man who did all of it? The answer is both simpler and more complicated than you might expect. And it carries a final detail about Willis Lee that almost nobody who tells this story ever mentions. On August 25, 1945, 10 days after Japan signed the surrender documents aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, 10 days after the war, Willis Lee had helped to win officially ended. Vice Admiral Willis Augustus Lee was being ferried across Casco Bay in Maine in a motor launch. He was on his way out to his flagship. He was 57 years old. He had not had a full week's rest in 3 years. He had commanded every fast battleship in the Pacific Fleet through the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. He had worked at the pace of a man who believed, correctly, that every week he could shorten the war by even a small margin was a week's worth of American and Japanese lives saved. His heart gave out before the launch reached the ship. He died in the boat, on the water, 10 days after it was over. He never saw the surrender ceremony. He never gave the interview that journalists had begun requesting. He never wrote the memoir that publishers were already asking about. He never stood on a pier in a dress uniform while a crowd cheered the returning fleet. He got 10 days of peace, and then he was gone, in a motor launch, crossing a bay in Maine that looked nothing like Ironbottom Sound and everything like the place where his career had started. Captain Glenn Davis, who had commanded Washington that night in November 1942, who had written the action report containing the sentence about radar forcing commanders to trust what they are told rather than what they can see, went on to command USS Wisconsin and retired as a vice admiral. He outlived Lee by decades. He spoke about the battle at Guadalcanal in interviews and never once failed to give Lee the credit. He said in one interview, in the 1960s, that Lee was the only flag officer he ever served under who was genuinely more interested in being right than in being noticed. That sentence, from Davis, is probably the most accurate biographical summary of Willis Lee ever written. Halsey, who had made the decision to send Lee north, lived until 1959. He became Fleet Admiral, one of only 4 Americans ever to hold that rank. His name is on buildings and ships. His face appeared on the cover of Time magazine. He is remembered as the aggressive, instinctive combat commander of the Pacific War, which he was. He is also the man who, on the night of November 14, 1942, handed a quiet mathematician 6 ships and told him to stop a Japanese battleship from destroying Henderson Field. That decision deserves as much credit as any speech Halsey ever gave. He made it in minutes, against doctrine, with almost nothing left. It was the right call. Lee is buried at Arlington National Cemetery under a plain white marble headstone. The inscription gives his name, his rank, his dates, and notes his Olympic medals. It does not mention Guadalcanal. It does not mention Hiroshima. It does not mention radar. 50 feet in any direction, you will find headstones for men whose contributions to the Pacific War were a fraction of Lee's. Their headstones also do not mention specific battles. That is not the criticism. The criticism is that the Navy, in the decades after the war, produced official histories, public commemorations, and naming ceremonies for ships and bases and buildings. And Willis Lee appeared in almost none of them. USS Washington, the ship that did the killing, was sold for scrap in 1961. Her 16-inch gun barrels were cut through with torches. Her armor plate was melted down. By the end of that year, the physical object that had destroyed a Japanese battleship in 7 minutes no longer existed as a ship. But the idea she fought by is a different matter entirely. In the months following Guadalcanal, Navy planners studying Washington's action report understood, finally and completely, what Lee had built in that plotting room below the armored deck. The arrangement he had created, radar feeding a mechanical computer, feeding gun directors, feeding weapons, without visual confirmation required at any step, with a single tactical picture maintained continuously and updated in real time, was not a modification of existing doctrine. It was a replacement for it. They built it into every ship they could. The Combat Information Center, the CIC, was formally standardized across the United States Navy in 1943. It is a dedicated compartment, separate from the bridge, where radar returns, sonar contacts, radio intercepts, and weapon status all feed into one integrated picture. The officer in the CIC does not look out a window. The officer in the CIC looks at screens. The officer in the CIC trusts the instruments. It is Lee's plotting room, scaled up and refined and given a name. Today, the CIC or its equivalent exists on every warship larger than a patrol boat in every major navy in the world. The United States Navy operates it. The Royal Navy operates it. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, the successor to the Imperial Japanese Navy that Hiroshima belonged to, operates it. Every Aegis destroyer currently sailing the Pacific Ocean, including Japanese destroyers, uses a direct architectural descendant of the system Willis Lee built in USS Washington in 1942. The Aegis combat system, which became operational in 1983 and is currently installed on more than 100 American warships, as well as ships from Japan, South Korea, Spain, Norway, and Australia, processes radar data, identifies threats, and generates firing solutions continuously in real time without requiring human visual confirmation at any point in the targeting sequence. It can track more than 100 targets simultaneously. It can engage multiple threats in multiple directions at once. It is, in principle, exactly what Lee was doing in Washington's plotting room with the Mark 8 Rangekeeper, except that the gears and cams have been replaced by computers and the cathode ray tube has been replaced by digital displays. The principle has not changed. Find the target by electronics. Trust the numbers. Fire without seeing. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Falklands, the Gulf War, the entire 70 years of naval warfare following Guadalcanal. Every surface engagement in which a modern warship used radar to achieve a firing solution before visual contact was established traces a direct methodological line back to November 15, 1942, and to one man who spent 2 years arguing with admirals about whether you could trust a green glow on a cathode ray tube. The answer, as it turned out, was yes. The answer saved the Pacific War. Now here is the lesson that the technology obscures, because technology is easier to point at than the human decision embedded inside it. The United States Navy had radar in August 1942. They had it at the Battle of Savo Island, where 4 Allied cruisers were sunk in 32 minutes by a Japanese force that radar detected and human judgment dismissed. The operators saw the returns. The officers on the bridges did not trust what the operators told them. They looked with their eyes, saw nothing, and assumed the radar was wrong. The radar was not wrong. The gap between having a tool and believing in a tool can cost 4 cruisers and 1,000 men in 32 minutes. It can cost a campaign. It can cost a war. What Lee changed was not the technology. The technology existed. What Lee changed was the culture that surrounded the technology. He changed it the only way cultures actually change, which is slowly, through repetition, through demonstrated results, through the willingness of one person to keep doing the work after everyone around them has decided the work is unnecessary. He drilled his crews in darkness until darkness felt normal. He fired the main battery at sleds nobody could see until hitting invisible targets felt routine. He asked Captain Davis to trust numbers on a screen in place of the instincts of 30 years of naval service. And Davis, after watching the exercises in Casco Bay, decided that the numbers were more reliable than the instincts. That decision, made by a 49-year-old career officer on a rain-soaked bay in Maine, made November 15th possible. There is a version of this story where the technology wins, where the Mark 8 Rangekeeper and the SG radar and the Mark 3 fire control system are the heroes and the human beings are simply the people who happen to be standing near them. That version is wrong. The technology was necessary. It was not sufficient. Sufficient required Lee. Consider what happened to South Dakota. She had the same radar suite as Washington. She had, on paper, the same capability. She went blind from a wired circuit breaker and sailed into the range of Kirishima's guns and was hit 27 times in 3 minutes. The technology did not save South Dakota. The technology, in that moment, was irrelevant because the infrastructure of trust and training that Lee had built into Washington over months of drilling did not exist in South Dakota at the same depth. Having the tool is not the same as knowing what the tool is for. Now, here is the detail that almost nobody who tells this story includes. In the summer of 1945, the Navy assigned Willis Lee to lead a special task group designated as Task Group 38.9. Its mission was not combat. Its mission was to study, evaluate, and develop countermeasures for a specific threat that had become the most dangerous single weapon the Japanese possessed in the final year of the Pacific War. Kamikaze aircraft. The Japanese had deployed organized kamikaze operations beginning in October 1944 at Leyte Gulf. By early 1945, kamikaze strikes were sinking and damaging American ships at a rate that was alarming naval planners who were beginning to calculate the projected losses for the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall. The estimates for American naval losses in that invasion, accounting for kamikaze attacks at the scale Japan was preparing, ran into hundreds of ships. The estimates for American casualties on land ran into hundreds of thousands. Lee's task group was specifically directed to figure out how to use radar, the same integrated, trusted, CIC coordinated radar doctrine he had developed at Guadalcanal, to detect, track, and destroy kamikaze aircraft before they reached the fleet. The problem was not technically different from what he had solved in 1942. It was the same problem. Detect the threat by electronics. Trust the instruments. Engage before visual contact is made. Do not wait until you can see what is trying to kill you. He had 3 months to do it. He was still working on it when his heart stopped in that motor launch on August 25th. The invasion never happened. The atomic bombs ended the war before Operation Downfall became necessary, and the question of how many lives Lee's kamikaze countermeasures might have saved on the beaches of Kyushu became a historical counterfactual rather than a military reality. But the framework he was building for that task group, radar-integrated air defense, early engagement, trust in electronic detection over visual confirmation, became the foundation of the Navy's air defense doctrine for the next 30 years. It became the framework that Aegis was eventually built upon. He spent the last weeks of his life solving, in a new domain, the same problem he had spent the previous 3 years solving in surface warfare. Find the threat before it finds you. Trust the instruments. Do not wait until you can see it. He never had a flagship named after him. No naval base carries his name. The Wikipedia article about the Battle of Guadalcanal mentions him briefly. The Wikipedia article about the naval battle of Guadalcanal gives him more space, but less than it gives to the ships. The headstone at Arlington is plain white marble, identical to the ones on either side of it. From a quiet Kentucky marksman who won 7 Olympic medals and spent his career in the unglamorous machinery of naval gunnery development, to a 7-minute engagement that reversed the entire night warfare balance of the Pacific War and created the Combat Information Center that every warship in the world now uses. Willis Lee proved that the distance between a crazy idea and a changed world is almost always just one person willing to keep drilling when everyone else has decided the idea is not worth the trouble. The Pacific War ended on September 2, 1945. Lee died 8 days before he could see it. Some men change the course of history and are remembered for it. Some men change the course of history and are buried under a stone that does not say so. The distinction between those two groups has very little to do with what they actually did. It has almost everything to do with whether they survived long enough to tell people about it, and whether they were the kind of person who would have told people about it if they had. Willis Lee was not that kind of person. He was the kind of person who wrote equations in the margins of his notes and trusted the instruments and let the numbers speak for themselves. The numbers still do.